From the doctor who built a hotel of death to the fearsome executioner, these are the 5 most feared characters in history. Number 5. Dr. Death. Herman Webster Mudgett, better known as H.H. Holmes, a con artist and bigamist, was one of America's first serial killers. Sometimes referred to as the Beast of Chicago, Holmes is believed to have killed somewhere between 20 and 200 people. Holmes enjoyed a privileged childhood and was said to be unusually intelligent at an early age. When he turned 23 years old, he graduated from the University of Michigan with a degree in medicine, all while working at the anatomy lab. His life of crime started with some frauds and scams. In fact, as a medical student, he stole corpses and used them to make false insurance claims. Holmes may have used their bodies for experiments as well. He finally moved to Chicago, Illinois, and changed his name to Dr. Henry Howard Holmes to avoid suspicion. He started working at a pharmacy and became a respected man in his neighborhood. Taking advantage of this and the 1893 Columbian Exposition, which would attract thousands of tourists to the city, Holmes decided to build a hotel for visitors. Unfortunately, many guests did not survive in what would become known as the Murder Castle. It was a building with 4 floors: the basement, the ground floor with some shops and his own drugstore, a first floor of apartments, and a second floor with more rooms and private offices. It was filled with secret passages and spy holes in the rooms that Holmes used to spy on his customers. There were also hidden trap doors that led to the exit, an elevator connecting the basement to Holmes' office, as well as hidden slides. There was a room filled with torture machines designed by himself, too. But the true hell was in the basement. In there, he would use surgical tables and medical instruments to dissect his victims and remove their flesh. It is thought that he would sell their organs in the black market and the skeletons to medical institutions. But what did he do with the bodies? Well, he would get rid of the remains of the bodies by throwing them into a pit filled with quicklime. But he also used sulfuric acid or just incinerated them in a big crematory oven. When the World Expo ended, Holmes' income went right down. To keep maintaining his lifestyle, he simulated an accidental fire in his building to claim the insurance, but he didn't out completely. The insurance company commissioned an investigation to the famous Pinkerton Detective Agency. As the situation was really complicated, Holmes decided to go on the run through different states. Detectives started to tie the loose ends about the criminal history of Holmes. He was finally hanged in Boston in 1896 and took 20 minutes to slowly strangle to death. It is said in his confession, Holmes said, "I was born with the devil in me." Number 4. The Witch-Finder General. The early 17th century was a time of great anxiety about witches. King James I/6, a man already obsessed with witchcraft, published a book called Demonology in 1597 that supposedly outlined a witch's aims and methods, as well as the means to detect them. He was so obsessed with the black arts that he even convinced Parliament to pass the Witchcraft Statutes of 1604, which ruled witchcraft as a crime punishable by death. Another key to fears about witches was what happened in the 1630s and 40s when Scotland, Ireland, and then England and Wales were engulfed by the political, economic, and social chaos of the Wars of the Three Kingdoms in the British Isles. Within the political and religious chaos, one previously unheard of, Matthew Hopkins, emerged. He and his witch-picker colleague, John Stern, were responsible for the torture and execution of 300 witches in eastern England. They hung more people for witchcraft in that small window of time than had been killed in the entire preceding century. Encouraged by their success, Hopkins and Stern began to travel around eastern England with the only mission to destroy anything related to the works of the devil. It is important to note that they worked without any real authority. Many of the methods that Hopkins adopted to investigate these cases of witchcraft were taken directly from King James' bestseller, Demonology. This involved walking a woman to exhaustion before questioning, making the accused stand or sit in a room without food or water and watching them for hours, and the infamous ducking or swimming in a stream or river, where the accused would be bound, tied to men on each bank, and thrown into the water to see whether she sank or floated. Their most famous test consisted of cutting the arm of the accused with a knife, needle, or pin, and if she did not bleed, she was said to be a witch. What the supposed witches didn't know was that they used pricking with pins and needles to find spots that didn't bleed. Number 3. The Incompetent Executioner. John Ketch, generally known as Jack Ketch, was an English executioner famous for his barbarous botched executions. We don't know what Jack looked like or really very much about him at all. It is said that he was Irish and started working in 1663 as a hangman. But this wasn't just a case of pulling a lever and watching the prisoner fall to meet a quick, neck-snapping end. Most prisoners executed by Jack Ketch didn't die of a broken neck, but of a slow strangulation which could last up to 45 incredible and agonizing minutes. It was part of Jack's job to carry out this gruesome task from his headquarters at Newgate Prison, which chillingly became known as Jack Ketch's Kitchen. After that, he began beheading. By the time Jack was responsible for this method of execution was mainly reserved for nobility. However, Jack had a bad reputation for not being particularly good at decapitating. He used an axe instead of a sword, and there are 2 terrible beheadings in particular that turned him into the worst executioner who ever lived. On 21st July 1683, William Lord Russell was sentenced to death for treason against King Charles II. Before the execution, he paid between 10 and 30 guineas to Jack in exchange for a hasty, painless death. But it was not to be. Jack took at least 3 strikes to kill Russell. The execution was so shocking, even to a bloodthirsty 17th century crowd, that Jack was forced to write an apology to excuse his appalling technique. On 15th July 1685, James Scott, 1st Duke of Monmouth, was sentenced to death for leading the Monmouth Rebellion in a treasonous attempt to overthrow James II. Russell's execution was still fresh in his mind, so he gave Jack 6 guineas, considerably less than the amount Russell had paid. The resulting fiasco is a barbarous bloodbath. It took Jack Ketch 5 strikes to kill the Duke of Monmouth, although some claim that it was as many as 9. Jack was finally released from duty in late 1685 and, in January 1686, was thrown into the Bridewell prison for assaulting a sheriff. The year after Monmouth's execution, he was dead himself. But that wasn't the end of Jack Ketch. There is a legend that says he still lives on to this day. Number 2. Dracula. Vlad Dracula, posthumously dubbed Vlad the Impaler, was a Romanian medieval prince with a reputation of extreme cruelty and bloodlust that has survived throughout the centuries. Although most accounts of his violent deeds were recorded after his death, some by his enemies, what's for certain is that his cruelty has been well documented. Vlad Tepes' childhood was traumatic, and perhaps that was the trigger that would make him one of the most bloodthirsty characters in history. At the age of 13, his father handed Vlad and his brother over to the Turks as hostages in a sign of submission to the Sultan. In 1447, when he returned from exile, he discovered that his father had been beaten to death and that his brother had been tortured before burying him alive. From there, he vowed eternal vengeance. The Turks supported him and made him king of Wallachia in 1448, but the Hungarians expelled him months later for the one who had been the murderer of his relatives, Juan Hunyadi, an old ally of his father. 8 years later, he returned to his homeland and allied himself with Hunyadi, who took him as a counselor. In 1456, he defeated the current prince of Wallachia and he became king again. Vlad was ruthless with anyone who did not respect him, killing between 40,000 and 100,000 people in a single year. Documents written about that time describe that the new prince of Wallachia enjoyed blood and impalement. He surrounded his castle with impaled, and as a result, enemy armies fled terrified by such a daunting spectacle. Vlad executed anyone without a second thought, but his reign ended in 1476 during a battle against the Turks. He was a historical figure who served, 4 centuries later, as an inspiration to the British writer Bram Stoker. Oscar Wilde called his work Dracula the most beautiful novel ever written. In the wake of Stoker's novel, Dracula has become one of the most popular characters in popular culture, inspiring many more novels, series, and video games. Number 1. Twisted Serial Killer. Elizabeth Bathory was a Hungarian countess who purportedly tortured and murdered hundreds of young women in the 16th and 17th centuries. After her husband's death in 1604, rumors of Bathory's cruelty began to surface. The Count Palatine determined, after taking depositions from people living in the area surrounding her estate, that Bathory had tortured and killed more than 600 girls with the assistance of her servants. As well as beating, starving, and freezing them to death, Elizabeth bit them and stuck pins under their fingernails. Some believe that she even forced one girl to cook and eat her own flesh, while folklore tells that Elizabeth liked to bathe in the blood of virgins to keep her youthful looks. In 1609, Count Georgi Thurzo made an investigative visit to her castle on orders of the king and caught Elizabeth in the act. Due to her noble birth, she was spared execution and instead was put under house arrest, spending 4 years in the same room until her death. History reveals us that not only films, series, or books are plenty of horrible characters, but reality too. In fact, most of these fictional characters are based on real people. What is creepier? Luckily, history is also filled with great individuals who achieved monumental success in their lifetimes and who were awesome people. And what about you? Do you agree with our top list? Who do you think is the most insane character in history? If you are keen on horror movies, take a look at this video in which you will find spooky plots based on true stories. True stories.